July 21st, 1996. First light over the High Sierra Mountain Wilderness. Up here at 10,000 feet, the air's thin and cold. This is Bench Lake, Sequoia and Kings Canyon backcountry. It's some of the most remote country in the United States. And there's a man here, alone, 54 years old, bearded, deeply tanned from a life outdoors. He's breaking down his camp at a little ranger station. It's basically a canvas tent kind of tucked into the rocks. And he's around a 3-day hike from the nearest road, remote. He loads his pack. He puts on a pair of size 9 hiking boots. He pins on his National Park Service badge and name tag to his shirt, puts a pencil, a notepad, and a small hand lens that used to belong to his father into his uniform's shirt pocket. Then he tears a page out of a spiral notebook and writes a note. Ranger on patrol for 3 or 4 days. There's no radio inside my tent. I carry it with me. Please don't disturb my camp. This is all I have for the summer. I don't get resupplied. Thanks. A National Park Service ranger picks up an old ski pole to use as a walking stick and walks away from that station out into the wilderness. And believe it or not, this is a routine patrol, home in a few days. But that afternoon, thunder rolls in. Rain comes down hard around the gravel in his camp. It ends up washing his footprints away, so there's no real way to determine which way he went. Now here's what makes this man special. Up in these mountains, he was the best. When a hiker got lost up there, when a climber didn't come back down, when somebody walked into the wilderness and didn't walk back out, he's the one they sent to find him. Nobody knew this country better, nobody. And on July 21st, 1996, he walked into it and never came out. They launched one of the biggest searches in the history of the National Park Service. Helicopters, dog teams, around 100 people combing 80 square miles of rock and ice, and they found nothing, not even a single scrap of gear. The man who could find anyone vanished. It would take 5 years to learn what happened to him, and the answer just raised more questions. A radio was found switched on in the middle of nowhere. A letter from a dead man postmarked after he vanished. Bones in a creek that searchers already searched, and a search dog who tried to tell them where he was 5 years too early. And one more thing, the last book this man was reading, the one he talked about with just about every ranger he met that summer, was the true story of a man who walked into the wilderness and was never seen again. Curious. That was 30 years ago this summer. We've reached the 30th anniversary of this tragic event, and we still don't know if it was an accident or a goodbye. I'm John Genoa, and you're watching America's Strangest History, coming at you from the great state of Vermont. I want to pick at this mystery. What really happened to Randy Morgenson, the best ranger in the Sierra? Stay with me. His name was Randy Morgenson, and up in the High Sierra, he was a legend. Remember, he was the best they got. By the summer of '96, no working ranger logged more time in the mountains than Randy. This was his 28th season as a backcountry wilderness ranger in Sequoia and Kings Canyon, plus around a dozen winters as a Nordic ski ranger and snow surveyor. Now, you gotta understand what this job actually was. 14 paid rangers for a piece of wilderness the size of the state of Rhode Island. 2 of them patrolled on horseback, the other 12 on foot. And a ranger like Randy went out into the wilderness alone for an entire season. I'm talking months at a time here, just him and the mountains. He saw himself as caretaker of the place, so he hauled out everyone else's trash by the sack. Glass, cans, busted gear, 600 sacks of it over his career, at around 35 pounds a sack, comes out to 21,000 pounds of other people's trash during the course of his career. One man on his back out in the wilderness. But that's not what made this man famous with the other rangers. This is. For around 30 years, when somebody went missing in these 2 parks, there was an unwritten rule. You got Randy on the radio. His old boss was a ranger named Alden Nash, and Nash said Randy knew the country better than the map did. Nash said that Randy was so dialed into the mountains that he could look at a lost hiker's last known spot on a topo map, study the terrain, think about how the land pulled the person, and just know where they went. Nash tells this story. One time a Boy Scout got separated from his troop in the park. The night fell, nobody could find the kid. Randy looks at a map for a few minutes, traces a couple lines with his thumb, then he taps a little meadow and says, "Go land a helicopter in that meadow tomorrow morning. That's where he'll be." Next morning, they fly a helicopter out to that exact meadow, and the Boy Scout comes running out of the trees. He's scared, he's been alone all night, but he's otherwise alive and in good health. Randy figured that out from a map. Nash said John Muir himself couldn't have done that. And keep in mind, John Muir never spent half as much time in these mountains as Randy Morgenson did. So how does a man get this good? We're looking at a guy who's basically an American frontiersman living in modern times. As to how somebody comes to know the wilderness better than a map? Well, let's go back to the beginning. A little boy growing up in the 1940s. Randy Morgenson was born in 1942, basically grew up inside the mountains. His father, Dana Morgenson, worked for the company that ran Yosemite National Park, so the Morgensons lived right there in Yosemite Valley. While other kids played in city parks, little Randy played in the shadows of majestic mountains. Pretty cool. And Dana was an interesting dad. He was a naturalist and a photographer. He could name every flower and every peak. And on weekends, he took Randy and his brother up into the high country to teach them how to read it, how to survive. Now here's where it gets even more remarkable. The Morgenson family had some friends. One of them was a photographer named Ansel Adams, the Ansel Adams, the most famous landscape photographer in American history. And when Randy was a boy, Adams gave him his very first camera. Now another family friend, a writer named Wallace Stegner, he went on to win the Pulitzer Prize. Stegner took young Randy under his wing and taught him how to put words to a page. So little Randy learned photographer from Ansel Adams and writing from a Pulitzer Prize winner. He grew up to be both an artist with the camera and an artist with the pen. He wrote so much in his ranger logbooks that the park bosses taped notes to the covers begging him to, quote, avoid the James Michener syndrome. Randy wrote right back, got something against literature? Randy became one of the toughest mountaineers alive. He pinned on the Ranger Badge for the first time in 1965. Then in 1967, the Peace Corps sent him across the world to India, to the Himalayas. He went to guide school over there. He learned to climb vertical ice and rock from the best in the world. And then he came home to the only place he ever really belonged, the Sierra. And there's a story Randy told for the rest of his life about a day when he was a boy climbing a Yosemite peak with his father. Now near the summit, Dana showed him a tiny blue flower that only grows up high near the tops of the tallest mountains. The common name for it is sky pilot. Randy asked his father what it meant, and Dana said it meant one who leads others to heaven. Before we get to the summer everything went wrong, I gotta tell you something about Randy's job. Something that's gonna matter later in the story a lot. You just heard who this man was, the best ranger in the range. 28 seasons, commendation letters from park bosses starting his first season and running all the way to the year he disappeared. Never a single bad mark on his performance review, not one. So you'd figure 3 decades in, this man's got a pension coming, some security, a little something for all those years. Not so much, because the National Park Service has got a dirty little secret. Randy Morgenson, the legend, was a temporary employee. Every single spring, the park hired him, and every fall, the park let him go. 28 times. On paper, the best ranger in the Sierra was no different from a college kid working at a summer snack stand. They've got a name for rangers like Randy, seasonals. And the deal for seasonals is brutal. No retirement, not eligible, period. No pension, no federal life insurance, no health coverage for his family. Randy even paid for his own law enforcement training, his own medical training, out of his own pockets to do the government's work. Back in the 1930s, they had a nickname for these rangers, 90-day wonders, hired for the summer, gone by the snow. And look, that might have made sense for kids passing through, but Randy gave them 28 years. These seasonals were the backbone of the Park Service, the ones who actually lived out in the wilderness, the ones who fought for your lost kid, patched you up at 11,000 feet, and hauled out 21,000 pounds of your trash. And you know what Randy had to show for it? Nothing on his uniform said 28 years, no stripe, no pin, no medal. The Park Service gave out service pins, but only to permanent employees. So the most experienced backcountry ranger in those mountains dressed like a first-year rookie. His boss, Alden Nash, put it in writing in 1981, an official commendation letter. Nash wrote, "Your knowledge and experience in the backcountry ranger position is unsurpassed in these parks." Unsurpassed, the agency's words. And that same agency never gave the man a single benefit. A writer who studied this world put it about as cold could get. Seasonal rangers either quit or they died. There's no retirement option. And now here's the part that's going to hang over the rest of this story. After 28 years of service, there was exactly one benefit that Randy Morgenson was eligible for. Just one, the death benefit, a payment to his widow if he should die in the line of duty. That's it. That's the whole package. Of course, he'd have to die first. Remember that. So picture Randy in the mid-90s, 50-something years old, the best at what he does, maybe the best there ever was, and every autumn he gets a pink slip. Every spring he reapplies for his own life. No pension waiting, no safety net, nothing. Thank you, Uncle Sam. In case you're wondering if they ever fixed this, they didn't. To this day, a seasonal ranger can't retire from the National Park Service. Keep all that in the back of your pocket, because when this story gets to a widow and a name tag and a 5-year fight with the federal government, you're gonna need it. So that's who Randy was, the legend, the artist, the toughest mountaineer in the range. But during the summer of 1996, something was wrong. Randy Morgenson was a man coming apart. For more than 20 years, Randy was married to a woman named Judy, and Judy loved him. But loving Randy meant always coming in second to the mountains. His truest love affair, she once said, was never with another woman. It was with the High Sierra wilderness. But a couple years before he vanished, there was another woman. Randy had an affair with a fellow ranger, a woman named Lo Linus. And in the summer of 1996, that affair was over. But the damage was done. Judy found out, and the marriage started to come apart at the seams. The divorce papers came, and Randy, he sank. That winter, the man who read every nature writer who ever lived wasn't reading about nature anymore. He was reading self-help books, trying to understand why he did what he did, why life itself just lost its shine. He was depressed, the record's clear about that, but the one thing he was still looking forward to was getting back up into those mountains. So that spring, when he headed for the Sierra, he carried those divorce papers with him, right into the wilderness, unsigned. He told Judy he wanted to clear his head before signing anything. But the fact is, Randy didn't want to lose her. He wanted to fix it. And then came July 20th. Randy picked up his radio and called an old friend, a fellow ranger named George Durkee and Durkee's wife, Paige. There wasn't much to the call. The way they remembered it later, it just seemed like Randy wanted somebody to talk to. The combo ended with a line that the two would never forget. Randy said, "I won't be bothering you two anymore." And then he signed off. Now, out in the backcountry, there's one rule that keeps everyone alive. Every single day, every ranger scattered across those mountains gets on the radio and checks in with headquarters. One by one, "I'm here, I'm okay." It's the lifeline. It's how they know that nobody's hurt, nobody's lost, nobody's in trouble. On July 20th, Randy made his check-in like always. He reported nothing unusual. The next morning, he pinned that note to the tent and he went on patrol. And the day after that, the roundup came and Randy didn't answer. Nobody really panicked, not at first, because this was Randy, the man who practically lived up there. They figured he was just way out in some deep pocket of granite, too high, too remote for the radio to reach, maybe a dead zone. And to be frank, it's the kind of wild country he loved best. So it didn't raise the alarm right away. A day went by, then another, still nothing. And that's when the people started to worry. Because radio or no radio, this wasn't like Randy. A young ranger named Rick Sanger made his way up to the Bench Lake station, and there it was. The note was still pinned to the tent flap, but at this point, Randy wasn't just a few hours late, he was days overdue. So Sanger got on the radio and the words went out over the park frequency. The words no ranger ever wants to hear about one of their own, missing ranger. On July 24th, they launched the search. Now, when tourists go missing, that's one thing. That's not totally unexpected. But this, a highly experienced ranger, it's unlikely. The search team was made up of a crew of rangers searching for a man who taught half of them everything they knew. A park spokeswoman said that it felt like a manhunt for a cop killer. The man running the whole operation, the incident commander, was a ranger named Randy Kaufman. And you gotta understand what a search like this actually looks like. This isn't a bunch of people wandering in the woods yelling a man's name. This is science. First come the hasty teams, the fastest, fittest rangers in the park, running the trails and likely routes at dead sprints, hoping that he's just hurt and close by. He wasn't. So Kaufman went bigger. He carved the whole wilderness up into segments on a map. Then he sat down the rangers who knew Randy best and had every one of them score each segment. What are the odds that this drainage, this basin, this pass? They averaged the numbers, they ranked the segments, and the search followed the math. And Kaufman did something you don't usually see. He had his searchers read Randy's logbooks, decades of them, thousands of pages. Where Randy went, how he thought, which hidden off-trail routes he loved. They were trying to crawl inside Randy's mind and use it to find him. And early on, George Durkee did one of the hardest things a friend can do. He pulled Kaufman aside, away from the others, and he said, "You should probably know a couple things. The divorce papers, the depression, the affair that ended. Durkee couldn't bring himself to say the word everybody was thinking. The closest he can get was, Randy definitely hasn't been himself. Think about what that means inside a search. Suddenly Kaufman's not just looking for a lost man. He might be looking for a man who doesn't want to be found. And old Alden Nash put his finger right on the problem. If he didn't want to be found, he won't be. He knows how these investigations work. The searcher's biggest obstacle might have been the missing man himself. And there's this. Lo Linus, the ranger Randy had an affair with, was working her own station out in the backcountry when he went missing. They sent a helicopter out just to find her and tell her, and she joined the search. For 2 weeks, that wilderness saw an army. Around 100 searchers, 5 helicopters, 8 dog teams. They flew helicopters rigged with infrared camera, hunting for the heat of a human body against all that granite. They flew the cliffs, they walked the drainages, they ran the secret off-trail routes only Randy would have taken. And a wrinkle that made it even stranger, the last people to lay eyes on Randy were 2 hikers on a trail the day he walked off. And they said he seemed fine. He was good spirits, friendly. He even cheered him on over the next big pass. Now that's not a man who looks like he's saying goodbye. Then, somewhere in the middle of it all, something strange happened. A husband and wife came hiking over Pinshaw Pass and stopped at one of the missing ranger flyers. The wife got upset, really upset. Her husband looked at her and said, "Tell them." So she told the rangers. Her whole life, out in the wilderness, and only in the wilderness, she had visions. And out here, she kept seeing the same thing over and over. A man trapped underneath something. The rangers wrote it down. They thanked her kindly, politely. I mean, there's not much else they can do. They can't search 80 square miles on a vision, so they moved on. And then the search almost took a second victim. One of the dog teams was working in drainage below a place called Window Peak Lake. A handler named Linda Laurie and her search dog Seeker, a big giant schnauzer. The gully still buried in old avalanche snow, 10, maybe 15 feet deep. And they worked it. The snow gave way. Seeker went through straight down into the freezing water underneath the snowpack. The dog almost drowned. They hauled Seeker out, injured, soaked, but alive, and they evacuated the dog out of the drainage. Somebody filled out the incident paperwork, they wrote down the coordinates, and the search moved on. A dog fell through the snow. These things happen out there. Nobody thought anything more about it. Remember that, because 5 years later, that one moment and that one sheet of paperwork are gonna come back around, and when they do, it's gonna break your heart. Now picture what the search was doing to these people. At night, Rick Sanger sat alone in his tent. He's writing in his journal by lantern light, just trying to hold himself together. By day, they climbed and they hoped. And every evening, that radio roundup came and went, and Randy's call sign stayed silent. For 2 solid weeks, they threw everything they had at those mountains. And when it was over, the park put out a statement. 80 square miles of some of the most rugged country in America, around 100 searchers, but there has not been a single clue. Not one. Tragic. Ranger Kaufman had to make the hardest call of his career. They slowed the search, and then they ended it. The rangers went back to their lonely stations, and the park brought in grief counselors. That's how bad it got. Kaufman said, "It's a mystery, a real mystery. Sometimes I think I'm going to wake up and it's all a terrible dream, and Randy's back out at his station near Bench Lake and nothing's happened." But it wasn't a dream. Randy Morgenson was gone, and the official word was an accident. No sign of foul play, no sign of anything really. But out in the ranger world, whispers were already starting. The official story was an accident, but right from the start, things didn't add up. It started with the paperwork. Remember that note on the tent? Randy dated it June 21st, but he walked out on July 21st. That's a full month's difference. Then this one, the park turned up a travel form signed by Randy dated July 21st. That's the day he vanished. Only it was signed all the way in a place called Cedar Grove. That's a 2 to 3 day hike from Bench Lake. How does a missing man sign a document in 2 places at once? That's the question. And the big one. Weeks after Randy disappeared, his wife Judy got a letter in the mail from a county court back in Arizona. It was a request from Randy to call off the divorce, to reconcile. And it was postmarked July 22nd. That's the day after he walked into that wilderness and vanished. So, a letter from a man who was already gone. Curious. Now listen to this, because every one of those things has an answer. The signature down in Cedar Grove turned out to be a forgery. A payroll clerk used to trace ranger signatures against a sunny window to push their paychecks through faster. It's something that Randy okayed. So that's out. The reconciliation letter? Well, Randy wrote that before he left. In fact, a trail worker named Lori Church carried it out in her backpack and dropped it in a mailbox on the 22nd. So that's out too. As to the wrong date on the note, well, maybe a man living alone in the wilderness for weeks on end loses track of what day it is. Maybe. One by one, the spooky stuff falls away. But the big question, the one right at the center, that one's still unsolved. What happened to Randy Morgenson? The park brought in a wilderness detective, an investigator named Al Delacruz, and he ran down every possible scenario there was. Theory number one, Randy walked away. Maybe he started a brand new life somewhere. Now, on its face, it kind of fits, because nobody on this planet knew better how to vanish into wild country and never be found than Randy. He was miserable. He talked about far-off places, Mexico, India, the Himalayas, the divorce, the book. It's certainly possible. But Delacruz pulled Randy's bank accounts, his credit cards, all of them, and Randy never touched a single dollar, not since before the season even started. And a man building a new life needs money. Randy's money just sat there. So as to theory number one, I'm thinking, not so much. Theory number two, maybe somebody killed him. Randy made enemies doing his job. The year before, he got a horse packer run off the mountain, a guy called Packer Tom, for bad behavior out on the trail. And there was some darker theories that some irate backpacker murdered Randy and hauled his body out of the mountains. And it's not really that crazy to conceive because it happened before. Back in January 1980, a ranger named Paul Fugate, he walked out of a visitor center in a stretch of Arizona wilderness to check on a nature trail and was never seen again. Now, people assumed he stumbled onto drug runners and paid for it, but Delacruz ran every suspect down, Packer Tom included, and cleared them all. And Randy's high country? It's too brutal, too remote, too high for any drug operation or any killer hauling out a body, and zero evidence, not a shred. So theory number two, I'm thinking, not so much. Which brings us to the hardest theory of all, that Randy, a man sunk in deep depression, walked into those mountains to end it. And there were reasons people believed it. Years earlier, Randy and George Durkee pulled some climbers off of a mountain, a rescue. It was a good day. A park helicopter dropped the two of them off at a place called McClure Meadow, and they laid there on their backs in the grass, just watching the clouds in the sky. Durkee says to him, "What a great day to be alive." And Randy, he sits up, he looks out over the peaks and says, "The least I owe these mountains is a body." Curious phrasing. Durkee never forgot it. At the time, it just sounded like Randy being Randy. A little dark, a little poetic. But when a man disappears into the same mountains he said he owes a body to, a friend starts adding up what might be clues. Some figured Randy made sure not to sign those divorce papers so that if he died on patrol, Judy would still collect his death benefit. Maybe a last gift to a woman he hurt. But when investigators read Randy's private diaries, they came away believing he was a man at serious risk of harming himself. But even this theory's got holes that you could drive a truck through. Randy left no note. And a man like Randy, who could picture every single step of the search, who knew exactly how bad it could get for his friends, he'd never do that to them without a word. He didn't even take his gun. A service revolver sat locked up at the station. A ranger who was close to him asked if that's how he meant to go, how would he have done it? I mean, since he left the gun behind. Perhaps the biggest hole of all, Randy didn't want to die. Remember, he wanted to reconcile. He sent that letter to save his marriage, not to end his life. Low Linus, who knew him better than most, heard the suicide theory and rejected it. It didn't fit. So if he didn't walk away and nobody killed him and he didn't do it himself, that leaves the simplest answer there is: an accident. One wrong step in a place that didn't forgive wrong steps. But in 1996, they couldn't prove a single one of these because they still didn't have a body. And there's one more thing, the strangest thing of all. Remember that last book that Randy was reading? The one he couldn't stop talking about all summer long? It's the true story of a young man named Everett Ruiz, an artist, a dreamer, a kid who loved the wild more than anything in the world. In 1934, at 20 years old, Everett Ruiz, he walked alone into the Red Rock wilderness of Utah and was never ever seen again. Before he vanished, he wrote one last line to a friend. He wrote, "I don't think you will ever see me again, for I intend to disappear." And there sat Randy Morgenson, an artist, a wanderer, a man who loved wild things more than anything. He was reading that book, talking about that vanished man to every ranger he crossed paths with in the last summer of his life. Now, is that coincidence? Maybe. That's your call. Now, I know you want to find out what the mountains did to Randy Morgenson, and we're going to get there, I promise. But first, you need the rest of Everett Ruiz's story, because what happened to that vanished artist decades later is one of the strangest twists in American history, and it echoes this one. 1934, Everett Ruiz is 20 years old, a painter, a poet, a wanderer. He'd been roaming the Southwest alone for years, trading artwork for supplies, writing letters home that read like scripture. That November, he walks into the canyon country outside Escalante, Utah, with 2 burros and a season of supplies. Months later, a search party finds the burros alive, grazing in a place called Davis Gulch, but Everett is gone. Now carved into the rock of that canyon, they find a word, Nemo. It's Latin for no one. There's no body or tracks, there's no answer, just a 20-year-old artist erased from the earth. The theories piled up for decades. He fell, he drowned in a flash flood, he was murdered by cattle rustlers, he crossed the river and lived out his days with a Navajo. And then, 75 years later, the story explodes. 2008, a Navajo elder's story surfaces. Before he died, he told his granddaughter he witnessed a murder back in the 30s. A young white man chased down by killers on horseback, and the elder buried the victim himself in a rock crevice in a place called Combe Ridge. The family finds the burial site, scientists step in, a university lab runs DNA against Ruiz's nieces and nephews, they reconstruct the skull, they lay it over old photos of Everett's face. It matches. In 2009, it goes national. National Geographic publishes the story, holds a press conference, headlines coast to coast. The Everett Ruiz mystery solved. One scientist on the team called it an open and shut case, said it would hold up in any court in the country. 75 years of mystery, done. A state archaeologist in Utah takes a closer look, and the teeth are wrong. The dental records from the 1930s don't match the skull, so the family sends the bones to a military lab. The people who identify fallen soldiers, the best in the world at this. And in October 2009, the answer comes back. It's not Everett. The remains belong to a missing Native American man, and they were returned to the Navajo Nation. The whole thing, the DNA, the face match, the press conference, it's all wrong. The mystery everybody said was solved, unsolved itself. And to this day, Everett Ruiz has never been found. Tragic. And why am I telling you all this? Well, 2 reasons. First, because it shows you how badly the world wants these mysteries solved. Solved so bad that smart people with laboratories can talk themselves into an answer. Remember that when we get back to Randy. And second, because of a detail that still gives rangers the creeps. That summer of '96, Randy wasn't the only one reading about Everett. Lo Linus, the woman he loved, was reading the same book at her lonely station in the same wilderness at the same time. She called it a crazy coincidence. You can call it what you want. And while we're out here, there's another ranger we got to talk about. Remember Paul Fugate, the Arizona Ranger from 1980? The one who walked out to check a nature trail and never came back? Well, here's the rest of that story. And it's going to sound kind of familiar. They searched that monument top to bottom, nothing. Then about a year later, the Park Service made a decision. According to the press reports at the time, the agency ruled that Paul had, quote, voluntarily abandoned his position. They didn't just close the case. They fired the missing man. And then they asked his wife to pay back thousands of dollars of his salary with interest. Think about that. A ranger vanishes in uniform on the clock, and the government's answer is he must have quit, pay up. In 1983, a county sheriff's office announced that Paul had been murdered and said arrests were coming. More than one. Nobody was ever charged. And today, the case is still open. A few years back, the Park Service tripled its reward to $60,000, citing new information. Paul Fugate remains the only National Park Ranger who vanished on duty and was never found, because the second one was Randy Morgenson, and Randy's mountains were finally about to give him back. 5 years went by. In 1997, the Park Service did the only thing it could. They declared Randy Morgenson dead without a body or an answer, and the mountains kept his secret. Randy's brother Larry died the next year. He went to his grave never knowing what happened to his little brother. That's what an unsolved mystery does to a family. It just keeps taking. Then came July 15th, 2001. 4 young people from the California Conservation Corps hiked deep into the backcountry to a place called Window Peak Lake. This was their weekend off, a backpacking trip for fun. And consider this, before trips like this one, the crews got a warning about these mountains. A Park Service trail crew leader named Cameron Avison told them, people get lost here, people die. There's a backcountry ranger who got into trouble out here sometime in 1996, and they still haven't found him. They had no idea. Now, it started with an old weathered backpack. It's half out of the creek, sun-bleached and torn. They figured it was just somebody's abandoned junk. They grabbed it to haul it out as trash. The next morning around 11 o'clock, a crew member named Mike Nolther spotted a hiking boot. It was sitting in the water at the edge of a creek. He looked closer and let out a yell because it wasn't just a boot. There was a bone, a piece of a skull, a leg bone. In the end, 16 fragments. That's all those mountains left of him. A pair of green shorts in the pack turned out to be government issue, and that's when it hit him. This might be a ranger. Down in the Cedar Grove Visitor Center, a ranger named Scott Wainick heard 4 words over the radio that nobody said in 5 years. "I think we found Randy." They found his name tag too. It was still pinned to his shirt, wedged into the rocks. The proof was right there. Randy died in uniform on patrol. They packed up those 16 fragments and flew him out of the mountains. And this case finally got the one thing it never had: evidence. A deputy coroner opened up an official file in the matter of the investigation held upon the body of James Randall Morgenson. And on July 31st, 2001, the dental records sealed the deal. After 5 years, Randy was found. Now here's what the science could and couldn't say. A forensic expert examined every one of those bones, and the damage on them all came from animals, scavengers, and after death. Not a single mark showed an injury before he died. Now, Randy's fellow rangers always figured that he broke a leg in a fall. It's a reasonable guess, maybe even the best guess. But understand, that's reconstruction, not proof. 16 bones can tell you a man died. They can't tell you how. And that drainage where they found him, searchers crossed it back in 1996. In fact, it was one of the segments they scored the lowest, the place they assumed he wouldn't be. Even so, they searched it twice and apparently walked right past him. Curious. How do dozens of the best searchers alive cross the exact ground where a man is lying and find nothing? Well, one man figured it all out. Alden Nash. For 5 years, Nash hiked Randy's routes, chasing his ghost, and the answer came down to a dog. Remember Seeker, the search dog that fell through the ice and nearly drowned? That was this drainage, and that told Nash everything: snow and ice. Back in July 96, that whole gully was buried under 10, maybe 15 feet of old avalanche snow. 10 days before the storms rolled in is when Randy came through. It would have looked like solid, walkable snow, but underneath it was a hidden pocket of deep freezing water. Randy probably stepped onto what looked solid and went straight through. So he's hurt, he's alone in the water, he's in the worst possible place, and then the mountains covered his tracks. The snow melted and erased every sign within days. So when the searchers crossed weeks later, all they saw was snow. Randy was underneath it the whole time. And over 5 years, that creek slowly carried what was left of him downstream to the falls where that crew finally stumbled onto him. And remember that radio? It was switched on in the middle of nowhere? Well, as Randy's pack tumbled down the creek year after year, the radio worked its way loose, still set to monitor right where the ranger always kept it. So, mystery solved, right? Kinda. There are a couple things even Nash couldn't explain. Randy had a favorite book, Robert Bly's Iron John. He said it spoke to him. And in that book, a wild man is found at the bottom of a pond when a dog gets pulled down into the water. A dog pulled into the water. Same as Seeker, same drainage. And that psychic on Pinchot Pass, her vision over and over was a man trapped underneath something. It's curious. But now I gotta tell you the part that breaks my heart. Remember the incident paperwork from the day Seeker went in the water? I told you it'll come back around. Because buried in the official reports, there's a detail almost nobody talks about. According to the coroner's file, the dog didn't just fall near where Randy lay. Seeker actually alerted there. The dog signaled on the spot where Randy's remains were ultimately located. Then Seeker got hurt. He went through the ice, and they pulled the dog out of the drainage, and the search never went back to that alert. Got that? In week 1, a dog told them where Randy was, and Randy stayed under the snow and ice for 5 more years. No official inquiry was ever ordered to figure out why that alert was never followed up on. Not then, not after they found them, never. The question sits unanswered, like so much else in this case. It gets stranger when Nash and George Durkee dug through the old search records. They pulled the dog team's debriefing form, and the GPS coordinates on that form put Seeker in a cliffy stretch with no water at all, which kind of made no sense. Dogs don't drown on cliffs. Durkee stared at those numbers and saw it. A transcript error. Somebody's handwritten 9 was copied down as a 4. Fix that 1 digit and the coordinates land on the edge of a small hidden pool 97 feet upstream from where they found Randy's radio. 1 digit. So Nash's refined theory. He pulled the snow survey data, he talked to the ski guides, he studied satellite images. and he came to believe that Randy never stepped onto the snow bridge at all. He was crossing that creek farther upstream when the ice over a hidden pool gave way underneath him, the same trap that nearly took Seeker 10 days later. And Nash said that if Randy went through the ice, the marks would have disappeared in a day or two, melted clean, unreadable. So the mountains didn't just take Randy, they erased the evidence. The official ruling came down accident, a wrong step in unforgiving country. And even the author who spent 8 years working on this case landed there too. An accident. But he admitted what every ranger admits. We'll never know for certain what happened in that drainage. And Alden Nash, he hiked back up to that gorge one last time. He sat on the rocks above the falls. He looked out over the place his friend died, shook his head and said, "What a beautiful place to die." Remember what I told you back at the start of this story? 28 summers, 0 benefits, and exactly one thing Randy was ever eligible for. The death benefit, if he died in the line of duty. Well, here's what the federal government did with that. When Randy vanished, duty filed for that benefit. The one thing, the only thing. And the government said no. The law behind the benefit was written for city streets, for police officers, firefighters, cases with ambulances, witnesses, death certificates. It had no instructions for a ranger who disappears in 80 square miles of wilderness and doesn't leave a body behind. To pay the claim, the government wanted 2 things, a body and proof that he died doing his job. Judy had neither, so the denial came down in writing, quote, "The evidence submitted on behalf is insufficient to conclude that your husband's death was the result of a line of duty." Insufficient. 28 years of service and his widow gets insufficient. And Judy almost didn't fight it. Part of her felt wrong, divorcing a man, then claiming his death benefit. It was George Durkee, Randy's old friend, who wouldn't let it go. He told her Randy didn't want the divorce. His letter to the court proved that. Randy would want you to have this. He knew the pain he caused you. So she fought, and the Rangers fought with her, digging through the federal rules, hunting for any door or law left open. For 5 years, nothing. And then they found Randy. The name tag still pinned to his shirt, the coroner's file, the investigator's report, proof that Randy Morgenson died in uniform on duty in the mountains. And suddenly, the same government that stonewalled the widow for 5 years moved in record time. One day, an envelope showed up in Judy's mail. Inside, a check for $100,000 plus interest. No letter, no apology, not so much as a note. 5 years of fighting, and the United States government couldn't spare a widow a single sentence. Does this sound familiar? It's the same reflex that the government showed Paul 15 years earlier. The system didn't fail these families once, it failed them the same way twice. But there's one more scene in this fight, and it's the right way to leave it. May 2003, Washington, D.C. Now, George Durkee puts on his full-dress Park Service uniform and walks with Judy to the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial. And there, carved in stone alongside the officers and agents who died doing their jobs, is the name Randy Morgenson. 28 summers. It took the man dying and the widow fighting for 5 years, but the United States finally put Randy's name where it belonged. So, what really happened to the best ranger in the Sierra? Think about the man for a second. He knew the wilderness better than the map itself. When somebody else vanished into those mountains, he's the one they called. And in the end, those same mountains swallowed him whole. If there was ever a man alive who could have walked into that wilderness and decided never to be found again, it was Randy Morgenson. So which is it? The evidence says accident, and that's probably the truth, but you can't quite shake the other thing, can you? A man in the deepest part of his despair, the words in his private diary, and the line he spoke years earlier, "The least I owe these mountains is a body." Did Randy slip, or did a broken-hearted man finally pay a debt he believed he owed? We're not likely to ever know. I find the fact that he sent a letter trying to reconcile with his wife at odds with the idea that he intended self-harm. But maybe that's exactly how Randy would have wanted it. A mystery. But I'll leave you with 2 things. When they finally carried Randy Morgenson out of those mountains, there was one small object still tucked into the pocket of his shirt pocket right over his heart. A little hand lens, a magnifying glass. It belonged to his father, to Dana. It was the same lens Dana used on Yosemite Peak to show a little 8-year-old boy a tiny blue flower that only grows up at the top of the world, the sky pilot, the flower whose name means one who leads others to heaven. Randy carried his father's lens every single day with him for the rest of his life and had it on him at the very end. And one last thing. That final spring before Randy left the mountains for the last time, he gave his wife Judy a parting gift, a novel. It was called I Heard the Owl Call My Name. It's the story of a man who doesn't know he's dying until he hears an owl call his name. It's an old legend that says when an owl calls your name, death is coming. Randy handed Judy that book, then he walked into the wilderness and never came home. That was 30 years ago this summer. Some say the mountains took Randy Morgenson, or maybe he gave himself to them. But either way, Randy's part of the wilderness now. Down in the granite, the snow melt, the sky pilots, forever right where he always belonged. I'm John Genoa. This is America's Strangest History. Thanks for watching.